So I'm delighted to be here. I was, however, horrified when I realized that I'd been allocated an hour. I've been giving talks for 20 years, and if there's one thing I have learned for sure, a finding replicated in countless experiments, is that nobody wants to hear me talk uninterrupted for an hour. So I would like to try to get us moving into more of a discussion if you're willing. This is not the greatest room setup for that. But if you would do me the kindness of, if you can't readily speak to at least two other people in the audience from where you're sitting, would you just squinch up so that you can? So I'm going to ask you to do that in a little bit. That is a verb. I acquired it at 26 months. Okay, so I'm not going to talk really about legal aspects of data sharing, but I do want to talk about some of the ethical issues that that we're grappling with across fields, and particularly in my own field, which is biomedical sciences. There's a lot of things we could talk about, but I want to boil it down to 5 questions that I tend to hear people talking about over and over. And I'm going to give you a little scenario for each one and ask you what your own ethical intuitions are about each of these questions. The first one is whether there's such a thing as an unfair use. I'm sort of borrowing this term from copyright law, where we have the notion of fair use. It says, and you all know this from your teachers, we're all entitled to use little snippets of things that are out there in the public domain. That's just part of the ordinary fair play of intellectual exchange. But the inverse of that is, are there some uses of publicly available information, or perhaps even information that should be private, that we would consider unfair and out of bounds? The second is the question of competitive harm. So Mike just, I think, made a persuasive case that in some fields, it can be kind of Pareto optimizing for everybody to share. It makes a bigger pie that everybody can use. That's not true in all fields. And it's not true in particular in fields that produce inventions that are going to become intellectual property. So the question of whether data sharing produces competitive harm, and if so, what we should do with that ethically and when we make rules, is really important in fields like pharmaceutical development. I like to talk about your intuitions about that. Third is a question of incentives, and we've touched a little bit on this already. I think there's more we can talk about here. In my field, data sharing is not something that has arisen organically out of the intellectual curiosity and goodwill of scientists. It is something that has mostly been imposed on the field by a variety of regulators. And so there arises the question of how you make people share data, and whether you ought to try to incent people to do it or just tell them that they have to do it. So how do we regulate this area in fields where it needs to be regulated? Fourth is a question of what we say to people who say something along the lines of, I can't share because there are other people who are counting on me not to share, the people that participated in my research. These are the types of claims that we very often hear in biomedical product development. And I've been curious in my own research about whether those claims are standing in for something else, for self-interest. And more broadly across fields, I think it is just a truth that science remains competitive. And when we enter a world of data sharing, we're asking scientists to step out of that frame of mind and to work against a lot of forces that push them to huddle with their data and not to share. So how do we sort out claims about what's good for other people, and in particular research participants, from claims about what's good for us as scientists and data holders? And then finally, there are questions around governance. If we're going to have a sharing system, is it going to be governed by somebody to ensure that there is responsible use of the data or not? Should we have gatekeepers, or should we move towards the system that some fields have of truly open access to scientific data? So let me start with the first one here. And I'll give you a hypo. I'm a law professor. This is how we do it. So let me ask you to consider this hypothetical. And then I'm going to ask you to spend just 2 or 3 minutes talking with a few people around you about your intuitions about the hypo. And if you quickly reach consensus about what the answer is, I'd like you to examine why you think other people might not agree with that position. So here it is. Okay, so twist around and find 2, 3, 4, 5 people to talk about this with for just a second. Maybe we can begin by just introducing each other with names and fields if you don't know one another. Okay, let's see what we came up with here.
We had thought that there's, we're somewhat biased against the specific group and their use case, and so in the absence of the data supplier requiring it, we weren't confident that they're obligated to send the data and code specifically. We hoped that this might encourage Professor Mayhew to share the data openly, such that Professor Little could get what they had wanted, but perhaps others who had a different angle, may have less bias, would be able to engage with the data and maybe support kind of the self-correction of many results that Professor Little could have put out that could be biased.
Great. Okay, thank you. So the optimal solution here then would be for him not only to give them to Little, but also give them to the world, and then everybody can produce their own analyses. Anybody have a different view of what the optimal solution here is? Yes.
I would send it back to the data supplier.
You're going to send all the data back to the supplier.
Well, the request of copy of sharing. I would send the request of sharing the data back to the data supplier.
She wants all of his analyses, right, and code. So
well, he can send his code and his analysis, but not the data, in my view.
Why?
Because it's not his data. The data supplier might have not prohibited sharing, but you know, the data supplier is the one who's ultimately responsible for whatever consent the data was collected under, and I don't think that this researcher necessarily has control about what are the possible consequences of uses of the data. I mean, I think making a bold statement, I'm going to share it with the rest of the world, requires knowing how, under which parameters was the data collected. I think that stays with the data supplier rather than this researcher.
Okay, so as a lawyer, I might say to you, look, if the contract doesn't prohibit you from sharing, you know, the argument that you can't share is somewhat specious, right? You know, it seems like you're giving them the runaround in this case, for her, giving her the runaround.
Well, there's a difference between not being prohibited and being obliged to.
Okay. Steve, I know you're of the view that science is always self-correcting. Do you have any issues with the sharing of data here?
Well, I actually thought the two answers were terrific. I mean, as you know, there are several examples of this where the data was misused and used to harass the original investigator and to mislead the public. Although it's not clear that it's tenable to say that certain analysts, even given that history, cannot have access to the data. And then what ultimately happens, the big picture view, is if these very influential groups have their sway, government can pass laws and regulations saying that you don't have an option around sharing because you're discriminating against this group. So I do think that the first solution about making them generally available is an excellent one. I'm not thinking like a lawyer. I also like Chiara's point that the data supplier may not have thought to include that in the contract, assuming that an academic researcher would behave in a certain way. But I do think that while you couldn't be sued, perhaps for disseminating it, there does have to be clarification. Perhaps they want to change their terms of their contracts in the future, and there may be issues around identification. And there may be actual practical issues around supplying the raw data that the data supplier didn't actually think of. So I think the issues that Chiara raised were very good ones. But I think the social solution has to be the first one, because otherwise we get into an endless cycle of discrimination and recrimination. But this makes clear that making it generalizable will have both professional and social costs. We have to bear that as a society. I don't think there's any way around it. I don't think we control that necessarily by the original investigator holding tight to the data.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here that you guys have brought up. One is the question of what Mayview owes to the data supplier. So we, so far, when you're talking about data that we ourselves generate belongs to us, and we are sharing. But sharing is a funny word for what one does when one is giving a third party data that somebody was kind enough to give to us. And that's what a lot of fields rely on, these large secondary data sets that are produced by government or nonprofits, all kinds of other parties. And we generally have contracts to govern who can do what with the data. But I know from my own work that there are often errors and omissions in those contracts and things that weren't contemplated. So the kind of exchange here that Chiara and Steve was talking about here really goes to the question of, do I have a right to make assumptions about what's okay with the data holder? The second issue is equity. Can I make data available to some people and not to others? And there is a strong feeling in some fields that you can, because there are people who are out to do serious science, real science, quality science, and then there are various advocacy groups that are out there that don't really care about doing good science. They have a conclusion and they are interested in working backwards towards that conclusion with a data set. And the feeling is, I want no part of that. I don't want to facilitate that. Not only because I don't believe in the cause that they're advocating, but I don't believe in the method. I don't trust them to do good science. So this gets back to the question of, is science self-correcting eventually? Does the truth come to light eventually? And even if we think it does, are we willing to wait and go through what we have to in the meantime, both personally and societally, in order to get to that point? This scenario is not really hypothetical. This actually happened to a colleague of mine. That's what the organization involved is. And the individual that they had hired to do these analysis, was widely criticized for having subpar methods, but had the patina of an academic appointment and had really had a lot of sway in front of state and federal legislatures considering gun control laws. So this question of equity really troubled the investigator in this case. And then finally, there's this question of harassment that Steve brought up, and that certainly was also on the PI's mind in this scenario, that he knew this was going to be the start of years of back and forth, first with the academic who was seeking to replicate his results, and then with lawmakers who hailed him back into hearings to question why he had submitted flawed study results and so forth. And indeed, it was years of this kind of thing of trying to defend his work, which kept him from doing other work. So this one is really difficult to me and really raises the question of how to prevent the weaponization of data sharing. The use of the fact that we are willing and able to share to do harm, essentially. I spent my first 14 years at the Harvard School of Public Health, and there was a sort of story that went around the school. People talked about this the way like people in my grandfather's generation talked about the war. And it was the story of the Six Cities study, which was an environmental health study conducted by some of the leading lights in the field based there at the school in the 1970s. It was really of unprecedented scale and scope. They had 8,000 individuals across 6 US cities, and they measured all kinds of information about these individuals in order to assess the relationship between air pollution and health outcomes. And what they found was incredibly striking, that there were health effects, including premature mortality, that were very substantial, that were associated with exposure to particulate matter at levels that previously had not really been established. And in particular, that if you had exposure to very small levels of particulate matter in the air, less than 2.5 microns in diameter, and you lived in the dirtiest city in the study, you had like a 26% chance, higher chance of a premature death than those who lived in the cleanest city. So very striking findings. The EPA used this study and one other one, similar study done by the American Cancer Society, as the basis for issuing the first ever regulations under the Clean Air Act for particulate matter of that size. The health effects revealed by this study were so massive that under any reasonable cost-benefit analysis, the benefits of a regulation outweighed the costs. But the costs to industry were really substantial. And so this rulemaking process triggered a massive pushback by the fossil fuel industry, by manufacturing industry, to try to prove that the studies were wrong and that the regulations were not based on sound evidence. So they got congressional hearings held, and one tactic that they used was to mobilize citizens in groups to protest outside legislatures, specifically demanding that the Harvard investigators release their data so that the American Petroleum Institute and others could replicate the findings, or as they believed, not replicate the findings. So Harvard was all over the newspaper for conducting so-called secret science, and the investigators came under enormous pressure to release the data. They refused. This was back in the 1970s when informed consent forms always said, you know, your data will never be shared with anyone outside the research team and the IRB and any regulators we might have to disclose it to. And so they used that as a basis for refusing to release the data. But there were other things going on with the investigative team as well. Jim Ware, my colleague, said in an interview, we knew that if we released the data, it would be endless aggravation and defending against attacks. To have a hostile group combing through your data looking for anything to attack you about was not something any of us relished. And another colleague, Frank Spicer, worried that biased groups would manipulate the data. The crisis was ultimately resolved when the Harvard team came up with the idea of having a competitive funding opportunity for a third-party team to reanalyze the data, and they were willing to share the data with that third-party team. 3 years later, that team produced a high quality replication that confirmed the results of the original Harvard study. But these investigators lost years of their life and probably lifespan as a result of the fight against industry, with many people, criticizing them for invoking this participant confidentiality promise as a reason not to do something that they didn't want to do for other reasons, that they didn't want to be involved in this fight. The story continues in terms of the weaponization of data sharing with something called the Shelby Amendment in 1998. There's a senator from Alabama, Rich Shelby, who got a line inserted in a 4,000-page appropriations bill in Congress saying that federally funded researchers must release their raw data if somebody files a Freedom of Information Act request for those data, for all studies that are used to develop policy or rules. So this was originally interpreted pretty narrowly. The Obama administration refused to apply it retroactively and interpreted as only applying to really the pivotal studies that underlay a particular regulation. But it kind of sent a chill down the spine of a lot of academic researchers who complained that this really disadvantaged them, subjecting them to a data sharing requirement that did not attach to the American Petroleum Institute or any other industry-funded study. And there was at least one instance of an industry group using data acquired in this way to allege spuriously that an important health study was flawed. Recently, this has come back in the public eye because of an attempt by the current administration to try to reinvigorate the Shelby Amendment. In particular, Scott Pruitt, the current administrator of the EPA, proposed in 2018 a federal regulation, a proposed rule, that would automatically bar from pivotal consideration in regulatory rulemaking any study that doesn't have all the data and analytical models publicly available, unless certain narrow exceptions apply. So by pivotal regulatory science, we're talking about the studies and models that and analyses that underlie EPA rulemaking, like cost-benefit analyses and models and standard setting. So your study cannot be used to set policy unless all of the data and models are available. People who've heard about this attempt argue that there's something deeper going on in today's political environment, that this actually was not the same as what was going on with the Six Cities study, where lawmakers were trying to do lawmaking based on the best available science, and there was a dispute about whether a scientific study was valid or invalid. Rather, because this rule comes down in the context of a broader move away from using science or evidence at all in a lot of rulemaking, it's cast in a different light. And again, the argument is that this is an attempt to impose data sharing obligations not to facilitate better science, but to knock science out of consideration for policy, particularly given that a lot of the studies that have already been conducted, existing data sets were collected under conditions which subjects were told their data wouldn't be shared. So it's become a subject of intense political controversy in some fields. It's a much, much more complex situation in fields like environmental health, biomedical product development, than it is in psychology. Let me move on. I want to talk next about the question of competitive harm. So this again comes up in fields where we're dealing with inventors, people who seek to eventually reap intellectual property from the scientific knowledge that they've generated. So let me give you another hypo here and ask you again to talk about it for a couple of minutes. Okay, so what do you think? Did you have a question, Bella? Okay. Is there anyone here from a field that is adjacent to drug development?
Say the question again.
Anybody working in a field that is related to drug development might have some similar insight.
So I haven't, so just
Okay.
right now.
Yes. Well, let me start with you then. What did you guys think about this question of the risks and benefits, the cost of it?
Well, speaking specifically about clinical trials, which are authorized by government agencies and are meant to produce indicators that a drug is at least not unfriendly to human life and may actually be helpful to human life. It seems to me that the statistical results of the clinical trials need to be exposed, should be exposed, are exposed, and all kinds of code that analyzes those should be allowed to happen. Therefore, there could be an active debate. If it's hidden, they are violating the terms of the clinical trial, it seems to me, and that should be forbidden.
Suppose it's not NIH funded, 70% of them are not. Would you feel differently?
I don't care whether they're funded by the government or funded in the development stages by proprietary interests. The point is that the clinical trials are authorized by a government agency, and if the statistics
We're
are
talking about the FDA.
FDA and EMEA in Europe and Central, if those statistics are not made available, mistakes will occur, people will die. We have the example of a poppy business at Duke who created statistics. And if it hadn't been for the statisticians who finally got after it, he would have killed some people with his foolish drug, his foolish approach. That's not acceptable as a result of the clinical trial. We can't kill them in the trial. We shouldn't kill them after the trial.
A fair point. But isn't that why we have the FDA? If they get all this stuff, it shouldn't be up to Eric Topol or whoever to do his own analyses and second guess the work of the regulator.
I think it's okay to second guess, but I think the regulator has to decide whether or not the treatment is efficacious, whether it's a drug or something else.
Okay. Thank you. What about the fact that it includes drugs that were never approved? Because all the arguments that you're making is predicated on the idea that these products are out there and might be hurting people. How about, I did a trial, my drug was done. Why should I have to give you the data from that trial? and moreover, if I do give you the data from that trial, involves competitive harm for me. Can anyone make that argument? Why would that be the case if it involves competitive harm?
They must believe that there is something about the basic science that they have discovered or manipulated.
Thanks, Frank.
That enables them to believe that there is some kind of profit to be made on the application somewhere else.
Yeah, it's something like that. I've heard that articulated that, you know, this thing didn't work out, but there was a mechanism that had some promise here that we want to hold secret. Or sometimes I've heard them say, well, even illuminating blind alleys for our competitors imposes competitive harm. We would like them to spin their wheels on molecules that won't work, rather than chasing us down in a market where we have a product that is working. So there are cognizable ways in which there is competitive harm here. But there are also clearly a lot of benefits to sharing data, even data about products that didn't work. So for one benefit, as you say, might be that we end up developing a product that does work based on something we learn about that trial, or testing it in a different population, for example. But there are a bunch of other things that people point to as sort of countervailing factors when companies or inventors make argument about competitive harms. We've talked about one of these a lot already, and that is just the idea of accelerating discovery by combining data and exploring questions in new ways or exploring new questions altogether. And that can be particularly important in medicine when we have clinical trials that are simply not large enough to explore questions relating to particular subpopulations, or to explore rare conditions, rare diseases. The prospects to pool data and accelerate learning are really very exciting and can be very important as we continue to chase the promise of precision medicine. We've also, of course, talked about kind of illuminating the dark side of sciences, that sometimes there are studies that are flawed, that can't be reproduced for one reason or another, and that ought to be exposed. And again, in the biomedical context, everybody can tell stories about drugs that have been exposed because others have had access to the data and have analyzed them in ways that reveal flaws in the original data analysis. It's also the case that once we move towards a world where we understand that these data are going to be shared, it makes scientists get more responsible about producing the metadata that accompany those data sets and can enable people to use them. And that really just facilitates good, sound methods in the course of research. And there are other benefits as well here, just reinforcing a culture of openness generally in science, keeping funders from spending money on ideas that others actually have already chased down and found that were not working. Again, having access to those data tells us what is not worth spending money on as well as what is. And most importantly, to many ethicists, there's the idea that in a lot of research projects, human participants are volunteering their time and incurring not only personal inconvenience, but risk. And that we honor them. We show respect for persons by making the absolute most that we can out of every data point in those research studies, that this is indeed what they would want.
So there's an additional benefit. And that benefit is that if there is data and code sharing, there's the possibility that the partner interests might cooperate, share benefits, share profits, share expenses. This actually happens in a whole layer of pharmacological development by those firms that do development but can't bring the product to commercialize it. They need to have another developer. And sometimes they pass over what they believe to be something that's good based on in vitro or in vivo experiments, humans, that would indicate to another company that they should run it. And there are licenses that share benefits all the time, made by that little slice. Indeed, the pharmaceutical particulars don't do much development of anything.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I love that vision of a possible future for the industry. So lots of benefits. So what are the specific harms that we're sort of trying to balance those benefits against? We've talked about the idea that by illuminating either trials that were successful or trials that were unsuccessful, we show competitors the way to develop competing products. And that can, in some cases, involve massive economic harm for what could have been previously a monopoly market for the first mover. But there are also lots of problems related to patents. And this is the one brief fora taken to the legal side of things. There are several risks associated with disclosing key information about one's invention. One is that once that information is out there, it becomes part of what we call the prior art, stuff already known, generally known. And in order to get a patent, you've got to show an innovation over the prior art. And so early disclosure, putting something out there in the public domain, can make it harder to make the case that you should get a patent on that invention later on. There are other problems, such as patents are awarded for a limited period of time. And once information is published, meaning put out in the public domain, it can be possible for folks to go to court and argue that this should start the patent period running. And that, again, can mean very sizable losses for companies who are extracting a monopoly price for their invention during that period of patentability. And then finally, we're basically arming our competitors in what is a race to be the first to file a patent application in a given jurisdiction. Most countries, there are some blocks like the European Union, but generally speaking, most countries have their own patent systems, and inventors go from country to country patenting their inventions. And the person who gets the patent there is the first to file. So if you've got a sort of half-cooked idea and you put it out there, somebody else can scoop it up and be first to file and beat you in the patent race. So there are some real potential costs in terms of intellectual property here. Finally, there are some costs that companies talk about often associated with helping people use the data. Mike talked about having an ingenious solution to this in his platform that sort of standardizes the presentation of data sets in a way that people can scoop them up and work with them without any help. That doesn't tend to be the way things work right now for clinical trials, although things are moving in that direction. It is non-standard. And most of us, even in the social sciences who generate and work with data sets, understand that even with a code book and variable definitions, it can be really hard to figure out how to use data. So they can be substantial costs involved in just helping users navigate those data. Also in evaluating requests to receive the data, whether they are legitimate, whether people are willing to have adequate data security measures, and legal costs associated with drafting data use agreements. These are all things that data holders talk about when the question of will you share your data come up. They might say something along the lines to, I'd be happy to, but who's going to pay for all this? I don't have the time or resources to do this. So there are some real commercial harms that have to be weighed against the benefits. And the question of how we weight them should depend on how much we think these data are going to be used by competitors versus other academic scientists. In some fields, like psychology, it's clearly mostly an academic game here. Other fields are not like that, but it's actually kind of empirically unclear how often shared data get used by academics versus other inventors who are trying to sort of win in a race. There are a few data points that we can point to. One's from human genomics, the dbGaP database, which is GWAS data, genome-wide association data. 82% of the data requests in one study came from academic or government or not-for-profit organizations, suggesting in that field relatively low use by industrial competitors. But for clinical trials, the picture looks a little bit different. This data from the European Medicines Agency is pretty old. It's the latest available, but it shows that a majority of the data requests came not from other academics, but from people in the industrial sector. Pharmaceutical companies, 39% of the time, or consultants that work for those companies, legal firms, and a variety of other outlets that are affiliated with potential competitors, lending credence to concern that you're asking me to go to an awful lot of cost and trouble here so that other people can free ride on my work. The YODA database is out of Yale. That's Johnson & Johnson clinical trial data. And there the picture looks pretty different. Almost all of the requests that they have come from academic organizations. So because these data are unclear, there's still a lot of debate going on in the biomedical space about fairness and competitive harm over use of clinical trial data. All right, let's move on. Question 3 is about incentives to share. And let me give you a third hypo that may seem very familiar to a lot of you. Okay, take a couple minutes to talk.
So, yeah, I'll walk through that. Yes. Right.
Okay, any economists here with us today? All right, anybody think Stover should not have to share? It's okay to express the view. Okay, let me go to you. Why shouldn't you have to share?
We just have a lot more questions about information. I think one is, what is exactly is this data? Because it suggests, right, when you're linking people on publicly available data, you need your best guess about information. So you re-identify subjects who are promised. Maybe not fully, but pretty close. So there's implications there. What did the IRB say about this study and what the regulations were for sharing? I think the other thing is you say access for the data set and then they want to use for new big data approach. And those are different things. And I wonder about kind of for unpublished research, you know, sharing your data is one thing, especially once your research has been published, but this seems like people trying to get in on her work without necessarily crediting her. I think if it was a published data set and they were crediting her methods, that's
They're acknowledgements. They're going to credit her methods, right?
or citation methods.
This question is kind of the last in the series of many other questions that might need to address first. But if you only focus on the credit issue, I think these are government funds, they're public funds. Supposedly they're there to advance science and knowledge in society. They should be used and credit should be given for what is done. So if Professor Stover, all she did was get $500,000 and sit back and that's in someone else work, whatever, that's what should be stated, that this database was built with funding that was won competitively or whatever by Professor Stover. If she had intellectual input to that, should be credited, should be stated as such. If she has intellectual input to the specific project, like the analysis plan, the idea, the concept, making it better than what people think, again, it should be stated. So I think if we have transparency on who did what, and move a bit beyond authorship versus acknowledgement, which is a very misleading type of construct. This type of setting gives an opportunity to move beyond that misleading construct. And I think it's fair for it that that's what it did, and this is the credit that I give for it.
Now, John, thank you. So, sometimes when I have a study, I have a big data set, and I think, great, I can see 6 papers here. I can see at least 6 papers that my trainees and I can get out of this data set. And I do the first 2, and then life happens, right? You get distracted, and the other papers are a little bit slower to come. Your trainees aren't as good as you thought, or whatever. But they're still out there, right? And maybe I even talk about those papers in my grant proposal. Now, if I'm a Stover's position, I have to give away those papers under your line of logic. Anybody see a problem with that? Bella?
I don't know if I have a fully formed idea. Actually, we are currently in the process of doing exactly this thing with grant money, and we can easily deal with all the regulatory IRBs and these types of things we have at RBC, and we are currently talking about once this $500,000 built. So one of the solutions we've come up with is having multiple versions of the data so that we can share, say, fully anonymized. But for the good stuff, we would probably have people doing consortium to prevent duplication, and also to make sure that that there was a kind of a mutual. So that's kind of the pathway that we are considering. I don't know if that's
And do you hold back the good stuff forever?
No.
If
If you want the good stuff,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not done yet, but in 2 years, when people want the good stuff, they say, look, I'm going to do this kind of analysis. Great, join a consortium. Let's talk about it together. Betty Sue over here is already doing that analysis. Maybe we should work together. Like authorship and shared credit as well as shared responsibility.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, we'll take one more. Steve?
2 things. So first, I do think the duration of time is critical. You can't hold it forever. So in the trial space, the duration is basically decided it's a year. So you get that track, and you have, even if you don't complete those secondary papers in a year. By the way, 90% of which never get written anyway. We know that. You have a huge head start, even if somebody else wants to start in a year. So you do get your head start. You do have but there has to be social value. It retains some of the social value, but you can't monopolize it. The other thing is, and this isn't exactly what you have up there, but in the world where this describes a world where if you don't publish a paper or your graduate students don't, they have nothing else to work on. But and this comes up in clinical trials. But if everybody is sharing their data, and it's like that, if you develop a collective ethos, then they can work on the data of others. So it's very difficult to imagine a world in which all these data sets are now more freely available. So it's not just the private property of an individual investigator who then has to spread it out over multiple years, as we've seen.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think what makes this hard for many fields is that we are in this kind of adolescence for data sharing, right? Where there's a feeling that it should happen, and there are some
regulatory forces pushing in that direction in some fields, but in a lot of cases you don't have to. And there aren't, in most fields, big repositories of data out there that we're all benefiting from. On average, it seems like more of a pain than a benefit for a given investigator to have to participate in this scheme right now. So I think these incentives problems will shift. I'm going to have to just keep us moving along here as the field matures. But, you know, at the present time that, you know, we've hit on a lot of concerning issues. I think there is still in many fields this kind of Lockean view of property rights and data sets. You know, John Locke, this liberal writing in 1690 in his second treatise of government, had the notion that, you know, when you mix your labor with something found in nature, you take ownership of it. It becomes of you, and you have property rights in it. And boy, building these data sets sure feels like labor sometimes. It feels like there should be at least a fair opportunity to be first and to avoid being scooped. And that's, you know, one of the dangers here that Stover is thinking about here. I think the broader question, unless we are moving in a world where there truly is this data commons that we're all drawing benefit from, what is the incentive to be Professor Stover in a world where there are data sharing obligations, yet not a lot of data out there for us to benefit from? Why would we want to be first to collect data? And then I think there are also real concerns that I've talked about already with regard to companies about just the pain in the ass factor associated with generating, providing, and assisting users with data sets. I mean, we've all had the experience of having to help somebody learn how to use your data set. It's never as easy as they make it sound to be in that first email. And then we've talked about various ways in which we might develop mechanisms for shared credit. I think some of these are very promising. But they won't be fully promising until the power structures align to recognize and appreciate those various forms of credit as much as they do the more traditional jewels in the crown of being first author, senior author. You know, being a data author, for example, is something that we've talked about quite a bit, but maybe a lot of promotion committees don't yet recognize data authorship as something to be rewarded. Finally, I think it's really curious how much variation there has been across fields in how these issues have been dealt with. Some have been very open from the beginning, and others it seems like could just never get there, even though we all work in the same scientific ecosystem. Let me skip ahead a little bit and go to the next hypo here. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask for some individual reactions to this. So this is not, no one's making the company participate, but it would rather not, maybe for some of the reasons we've talked about. But it points to what many systems say is a very valid concern, that this was not covered in the informed consent form. And indeed, it's really only been in the last year or two that IRBs have even started thinking about how to include consent form language for data sharing. Previously, they've always insisted that on all of their templates, your data will never be shared. Regulators. So, do you think a drug company could decide to share in this situation, or would they be betraying your research participants? Over here.
Well, for copyright, when we want to make things available electronically, we go back to the author and ask for permission. So one option would be to go back and go to the participants of the trials and get the permission so that you have a legal standard to then share.
Yep, that's always a possibility. You know, the PIs will always push back and say, well, it's just impossible for us to go back and get them. And there's also the possibility that when you do go back and ask, not everyone will say yes. And now you've got a statistical problem in your head, and often an equity problem too, because we know carefully that people who are most likely to opt out are members of racial and minority groups that are already underrepresented in a lot of research we really like to have in there. Yes, Russ.
So at least here, the data are de-identifiable, and they don't actually count as human subjects data, right? So that's, you know, we share a bunch of brain imaging data completely openly. You don't even have to sign in, you just go download it. under that assumption, and I got a lawyer to say, yes, you actually identify the data
Yeah.
to make sure to cover me. But,
Yes.
but you know, if I can do that with Raven's data, I don't see why they couldn't do that. Here.
So as a legal matter, you're absolutely right. Does everyone also feel comfortable with that on ethics, right?
I mean, I'll just raise a potential issue, which is that even if it's de-identifiable now, it may not be in the future. So, for instance, with brain imaging data, it's almost like very good to be able to get out of structural MRI image some identifying information in some future or genetics data, or if you just have a zip code, some other identifier, you may be able to compute. So I'm not saying that that's not legally valid, but I do worry actually about the identifiability of subjects that are participating.
Yeah, so that's one big concern that's being discussed in the research ethics literature right now is our entire regulatory structure is predicated on the idea that once de-identified, always de-identified. When our colleagues in computer science tell us that this is a fiction, it's a fantasy. But the other issue is more fundamental, and that is a question of, regardless of what the law says, is all that matters whether subjects are at risk. There is another line of ethical reasoning that says, look, regardless of whether there's risk or no risk involved associated with re-identification, people gave this data to you under a certain set of conditions. You had an agreement, a compact with them. It was going to be used for a particular purpose by you. And now you're talking about using it for God knows what purpose, by God knows who, anybody. And that really transgresses the nature of the ethical compact that you had with participants. So that's the line that drug companies very often say in meetings about data sharing. I wish I could, but I've made these promises to participants and I have to protect their privacy. And again, this calls to mind this line in the show Friends, where Monica needs to move her apartment and she wants Phoebe to help her pack up all her boxes, and Phoebe said, oh, I wish I could, but I don't want to. The question, again, is always the authenticity of companies' representations when they're talking about participants' interest. Because we know from research that I and others have done that actually clinical trial participants really want their data shared and really don't care about most of the risks or potential misuses of data that might occur. There's a small minority, 10, 15%, who do, but most don't. And most are willing to brook reuse of their data even without specific informed consent to data sharing in the informed consent form. So we may be moving past a world where we pin everything so closely on informed consent and towards a world where we think about other forms of accountability. I'm just going to skip forward here into the last question here, and that is how we ensure accountability for data uses here. We're not going to have time to discuss this one, but it's also one that should seem pretty familiar. The idea is that data have been shared with the company by a hospital for one use. The company then develops a way of re-identifying and linking data to social media data, other data that are out there in the digital wilds, and is now developing a business model selling this, again, de-identified data for a variety of other uses. No IRBs involved once that initial data transfer takes place. No governance of any kind beyond the ethics of the tech company. And again, the argument that, well, it's de-identified, and so what's the harm? So it really raises a host of questions about how, if at all, we ought to regulate this area. And I'll suggest 3 ways in which I think we might think about upending our traditional approach to data privacy regulation to try to accommodate questions like this. One is to get away from regulating how data are transferred and start regulating how data are used. Most of our privacy laws, at least in the health information space, focus on a covered entity transferring data to another covered entity in a particular way. They're going to focus on that data exchange. They pay very little heed to what the data are going to be used for, but an alternative approach could have a committee that considers individual uses of data. For example, the committee could be convened by tech company and include representatives of a variety of stakeholder groups and rule on individual proposed uses of the data. Secondly, we might think about shifting our focus from what individuals consented to in informed consent forms or end user license agreements in apps, and
toward a more representational approach where we engage in deliberation with representative groups of sectors of the public to understand better what people's thinking is around these issues, and try to design wise governance schemes based on how groups think about this rather than how individuals do. And then finally, we can end data exceptionalism, siphoning off particular kinds of data, particularly health data, and applying special rules to them, and think about more broadly about regulation and governance of data use more generally, whether it's health or all kinds of other data, because we know that all data now are potentially sensitive, whether it's a picture of your face that might be used by law enforcement, social media that might indicate illegal activity or membership in a marginalized group, or electronic health record data. So I think these are all things we could continue to talk about as we move towards this future of the digital or the data commons, which I think is more likely than not inevitable. And the question is, how can we get there responsibly? Thanks very much.